So-called ivory tower, so the classics department is known as Wesley Hall, but nonetheless out of Graham Hall and into the university and the community. And I think we've succeeded tremendously over the last 2 years, thanks to our audience members, so thank you most of all to you, and to our speakers who come here, some of them paying for their own way, and many of them doing this free of charge, as most visiting academics do. This year we have 8 talks, including 6 visitors to the University of Winnipeg. A record number of visitors, and we're very thankful for a large group of sponsors and organizations that have given us the funding to make this possible. Most importantly, the University of Winnipeg's own layered lecture series on science and social science in the community. And yes, we have a classics talk in that series. The Society for Classical Studies, the largest organization for classicists in the world, whose Classics Everywhere initiative is intended to bring classics research out of the classroom, as we do, and into the community. The University of Winnipeg Classics Student Association for their enthusiasm in helping organize the series, and perhaps most of all for their sponsorship of coffee. The Department of Classics, especially the chair of the department, Dr. Matt Gibbs, who's supported this series since I first mentioned it to him and forced him to give a talk in it to begin it. And it's preliminary, right? And I think in winter 2017. The University of Winnipeg Research Office has also provided some funding this year. And last but not least, Eric Roddy and the University of Winnipeg Marketing and Communications Office, who produced what we're constantly told by our visitors, including today's, is the most beautiful poster they've seen for a lecture, certainly much better than my artistic skills would produce. I do have posters for the whole lecture series, so if you have an office store or bulletin board, or if you can, I'm looking at Dr. McGilvery, put it on the Rhetoric and Communications bulletin board, or other departments around the university, please let me know and I can give you a poster to advertise our talks. As you can see on the PowerPoint, we're available on every social media platform, Snapchat, but nonetheless, we'll get there soon. So if you'd like to hear about the talks, you can give me your email address if you're not already on my comprehensive mailing list. You can follow us on Twitter, you can follow us on Facebook, you can follow us on Instagram. And of course, if you're around the university, you'll see the posters and you'll get the notifications in email and on the University of Winnipeg events calendar. The series, although we do have support on an ad hoc basis from some organizations on campus and beyond, is also sponsored by fundraising. In particular, today's speaker's trip has been made possible completely by fundraising last year through the University of Winnipeg Foundation. So if you're able to support Classics Talks on campus, we do have a University of Winnipeg Foundation crowdfunding fundraiser happening again this year. The URL is not so easy to remember, net community, etc. But nonetheless, I could give it to you and it'll be in any emails that I bring out. Any donation over $10 is tax deductible, right? So maybe in December you'll rethink that and think how much you need that tax deduction. Just before I turn it over to Ruth to introduce our speaker today, I do want to mention that unlike if you come in previous years, all of our talks will not take place on Friday afternoons at 3:30 in this room, 3D01. We will have 5 talks in this room at 3D01 at 3:30 p.m. But thanks to the Classics Everywhere funding from the Society for Classical Studies, we're also hosting 2 talks at the University of Winnipeg's North End Educational Hub, Merchants Corner on Selkirk Avenue. And we'll have 2 special talks about classics and contemporary political topics. The first on October 25th, when we'll have a speaker discuss erasure and absence in ancient and modern war memorials. And we'll have a talk on March 20th about the experiences of refugee and immigrant women in antiquity and today. So I hope you'll be able to make the trip out to the Merchants Corner campus to join us. If you haven't been there before, it's a fantastic facility, so I encourage you to come along. With that, I'll be quiet and I'll turn it over to Ruth to introduce today's speaker.
Dr. Katherine Blouin is an associate professor in the Department of Historical and Cultural Studies at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. She received her PhD in Roman history from the Université Laval and the Université Denise Sophia Antipoulos, as well as a postdoctoral diploma in Greek mythology from the École Pratique des Hautes alongside numerous articles and book chapters and a monograph. Dr. Blouin is the co-editor of the blog Everyday Orientalism, a platform through which students, academics, and citizens can reflect on how history and power shape the way in which human societies define themselves through the other. Her talk today is entitled Colonial Fantasies and Occluded Histories, the Case of Early Alexandria. Please welcome Dr. Blouin.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming on this Friday afternoon, day of the climate strike. I'm very grateful for the invitation, so everyone who took part in the logistics of having me come here, thank you so much. And it's been a special day for me. I was in Saint-Boniface this morning, and I heard French, and I felt like crying. I was really happy, and I had a great croissant, and then I went to the climate strike at noon. So I just want to join Peter in saying that obviously this wasn't planned, the overlap. So if you were at the strike too and you came back, I'm very grateful. And I hope that the discussion of today, which really deals with questions at the intersection of indigeneity, land, and power, will somehow be for everyone extra food for thought when it comes to thinking about Mother Earth. So I tried to do a little wordplay with my history thing because what I want us to reflect today on is how history can also be seen as an aggregate of stories. And the story we're going to talk about today is that of the foundation of Alexandria in Egypt and what was on that spot before. And before we jump into this, I want to start by telling you another small story. So it might not seem related at first, but it is. In 1916, a young Italian soldier who was on the northern Italian front wrote poems about his experience of the war. The young man was called Giuseppe Ungaretti. He was born in Alexandria, grew up there, and left Egypt around the age of 20 to go to France and Italy. His poems were eventually published during the war in 1916, and the title of the book is Il Porto Sepolto, which means in Italian, the buried harbor. Later on, because Ungaretti was lucky enough to survive the war, Ungaretti reminisced on how he came about choosing this title for his first book of poetry. I was told about a port, a submerged port from before the Ptolemaic era, proving that Alexandria was a harbor before Alexandria. Already before Alexander, there was a town. One knows no more than this. This town, which is my town, consumes itself, destroys itself from one moment to the next. How can we recognize its origins if nothing remains? Nothing even of what has just happened a moment ago. We know no more than this. We have no other sign than this port which the sea has preserved. A single piece of evidence to tell us of what was once Alexandria. The title of my first book derives from this, The Buried Harbor. Now, I'm not sure if you've known of this underwater structure, but I didn't when I was a university student. Ungaretti actually got this information from two friends of his, two brothers, French engineers who were working. One of them was an engineer working for the Khedive of Egypt, so the king of Egypt at the time. Even though it was a British protectorate, there was an Egyptian dynasty there. And so these brothers were called the Tuile brothers, Jean and Henri Tuile. Jean Tuile was an engineer working for the head engineer of the Department of Harbors and Lighthouses of Egypt, another Frenchman named Gaston Gendais. And so in the 1910s, Gendais, with Tuile and other people, investigated a series of water breakers that were under the water off, close to the edge of the shore, a bit west of the main historical harbor of Alexandria. These discoveries haven't been discussed very much by historians. A striking exception, which you can actually visit online, is a website by Arthur de Gros. I can provide eventually the link to whoever in the department can share it with you if you're interested, and he has a great page on the topic. But these structures were visible, as you can see, still in 2015. And now if you look at Google Earth, you cannot see them anymore. They're doing like land reclamation, and the picture is a bit too dark, so you don't see anything anymore. So Jourdain published his findings in 1916, the same year as Ungaretti's poems were published. And the brother of Jean Tuile, so the other Tuile, who was a writer, wrote about these discoveries in a letter to a friend, which ended up being published in 1921 in a book of letters. And he says, the works discovered by this erudite engineer exceed in importance those of the pyramids. And he even goes on to say that to him this is like comparable, if not better, than the temples at Karnak and at Thebes. The idea came to me that it is probably not Alexander who founded Alexandria. He only rebuilt her. It's already been several months since this book came out, and nobody talks about it. So what I want us to reflect on today is the question of not only the stories we tell ourselves, in this case regarding the site of Alexandria, what was or was not there before Alexander came, but also how these stories also rely on a very selective gaze, which implies a series of erasure as well, or silence, calculated or incalculated silences. So this is let's say, the question we're going to start from. How does the historical narrative regarding the pre-foundation of Alexandria relate or not with the available evidence, so the actual primary evidence? And why is that so? I will start by providing a brief contextualization of the geographical area where Alexandria now sits. Then we're going to look at what primary evidence we have, and following them in a chronological order as well, in terms of their discovery. And finally, I will propose some concluding remarks that I've entitled Colonial Fantasies and Occluded Histories. So Alexandria of Egypt is located in the northeastern part of the Nile Delta, so this green triangle that is formed of the Nile Delta, the Nile River having divided itself in more than one branches. So they were up to 7 in antiquity, now there are 2. And so the city sits between, to the north, the Mediterranean Sea, and to the south, a big littoral lake. So this is a reconstitution of how big it was in antiquity. It was called the Lake Mareotis. It is now called Lake Mariut, which is basically an Arabic version of Mareotis. Now the lake is much smaller, so it shrank a great lot. And throughout history, it's been fluctuating, depending on all sorts of criteria that I cannot get into now. The lake was supplied in antiquity by one of the branches of the Nile that flowed in the area. This branch was called Canopic during the Hellenistic and Roman period. In the Roman period, for a while, it was called the Agathos Diamond, or Good Genius branch, because it was providing Alexandria with water, after all. So through a series of canals, the sweet water entered the lake, and also other canals that provided the city, or supplied the city with fresh water. So the city is on a narrow strip of land called the Temia. So it's rocky. You don't have this thick sill that you have in the Nile Delta and Valley, and it is not very elevated. So actually a good chunk of the ancient city is now underwater, and the same goes for, as we shall see, settlements further to the east. This is a Google Earth view from the sea of the city today. So now it has like 5 million inhabitants. It's a huge city. You have to imagine in antiquity it was much more reduced. Our evidence regarding the early occupation of the site tell us about two place names, 2 toponyms. Paros, which gave its name to in French, the phare, so the lighthouse, right? That was the name of an island. So now it is linked to the mainland. It's been linked since the Hellenistic period, but originally, before that, it was an island called Pharos. And now, if you go to Alexandria, there is a fort on the spot where the lighthouse was, and two very good fish restaurants. I really highly. And the other site is called Rakotis. It is, if you've been to Alexandria, it's roughly to the south of the site of the big temple to Serapis with the big column called the column of Pompeii, which has nothing to do with Pompeii. So these are the two, let's say, the two core places attested or mentioned regarding the pre-Alexandrian occupation of the area. This is the view from the lake, from the side of the lake. You can see how the lake is much smaller now than on the map I previously showed. And the two areas are separated by about 3.7 kilometers. So let's say about an hour walk, something like that. I mean, you can still do it. It's not that far. Okay, so that's for the context. Now let's see what evidence do we have actually regarding the state of this area before Alexander arrived and founded this Greek Macedonian city. Our evidence are three main types: literary, toponymic, so the names of places, and geoarchaeological. So we're gonna go through them one after the other. So reminder again of these two sites, Pharos to the north and Rakotis. They are both mentioned in several literary sources, mostly, though not exclusively, Greek and Latin. So our earliest mention of Pharos is found in the Odyssey, so roughly 8th century BC. This is a passage about Menelaus who left Troy and pissed off the god. And then he ended up stuck in Egypt. So the text says there is an island washed by the open sea, lying off a Nile mouth. Seamen call it Pharos. It has a harbor, a sheltered bay, where shipmasters take on dark water that is sweet water, and most probably from the area of the lake or close to the mouth, which would have been the Kebatic mouth, for the outward voyage. So 8th century BC. Our earliest attestation of the toponym Rakotis is found in a hieroglyphic stela called, by Egyptologists, the satrap stela. And it is about a donation by Ptolemy I to a temple in Buto, the central northern delta. And the text in hieroglyphic reads, part of it narrates how Ptolemy established his residence, his capital, on the shore of the Sea of the Greeks, so the Mediterranean. And this residence, its previous name, was Rakote, so Kede in Egyptian. This is our earliest mention so far of Rakotis. Interestingly enough, no one has studied all the mentions of Rakotis in Egyptian sources. I'm going to come back to that. This is not an exhaustive list. I will just point you to some elements in it. So you have it's exhaustive as far as the earliest evidence go. In the 3rd century, Pseudo-Callisthenes Alexandria romance is interesting because it proposes the only Egyptian-rooted narrative about the foundation of the city. So it's commonly considered to be very romanticized and over the top. It's obviously written like 600 years after the fact, but it's good to acknowledge the fact that this is a different narrative from the one proposed by more, let's say, institutionally acceptable Greek and Latin sources, and it is also our only Egyptian one, if we exclude the satrap stela. The other source that I want to underline is Strabo, I want to underline Strabo because I've been looking at narrations about the early history of Alexandria from Montesquieu, from the early Enlightenment, all the way till today. And a general tendency about what we're discussing today is to paraphrase or to literally quote what Strabo says. And this is the core of the paraphrase. Now, the earlier kings of the Egyptians, being content with what they had and not wanting foreign imports at all, and being prejudiced against all who sailed the seas, and particularly against the Greeks, because the Greeks have no land, and so they just want to go and take ravage foreign lands and take their stuff. So the earlier kings, the pharaohs, set a guard over this region and ordered it to keep away any who should approach. And they gave them as a place of abode Rakotis, as it is called, which is now part of the city of the Alexandrians. And they gave others the parts round about the village to herdsmen, who likewise were able to prevent the approach of outsiders. So you have this idea here of an Egypt that's enclosed, of both leaders and Egyptians who want to keep foreigners at bay, who are wary of the sea and of the commercial exchanges that can come out of that with all the foreign people, especially the Greeks. Strabo wrote this together with a lengthy description of Alexandria. Partly based on his own experience, he came to Egypt under Augustus, Octavian Augustus. He was in the entourage of the prefect of Egypt. So, he's a very high-class statesman who completely espouses the pro-Augustinian narrative. So very anti-Ptolemy, very anti-Greek in many ways. We have to take that into account. And obviously, he writes that 300 years after the foundation of the city. So, in general, historians have been quoting this a lot, and I haven't seen any properly critical discussion of the particular context and positioning that characterizes Strabo's narrative. So this is something important, I think, to keep in mind here. So that's for the literary evidence. Now I just realized that my Coptic font was not in the I'm sorry. It was in Coptic. We're going to jump to toponyms now. So, Pharos has not been properly studied by Egyptologists in terms of what the original Egyptian toponym would have been. I have a slight suspicion that it might be linked to the Egyptian for the mouth, which would refer to the canopic mound. It's something I need to explore. I've surveyed a few Egyptologists at colleagues, but I want to expand on that, but just tell you, it's not been studied. This in itself is a fact. Rakotis has been getting a bit more attention from scholars. Some interesting points to take into account. So, in Egyptian sources, no matter the script, so in hieroglyphic, in Demotic, or later on in Coptic, what we see is that texts in Egyptian that mention Alexandria do not, most of them, call it Rakotis, or Rakote, or Rakoti, or Rakelet in Demotic. They much more rarely call it a transliteration in Egyptian of Alexandria. And generally, in terms of toponymy, it's kind of a universal thing. When there is such a resistance to a toponym and another toponym, an indigenous toponym keeps being used, it is a symptom of the fact that this indigenous toponym existed before, right? I mean, I can think of streets in Quebec City where I'm from that were renamed 10 years ago, and I just refused to use the new name. Highways and so I'm like, no. So that's it. This is kind of a meta. It could very well be a meta example of this fact. Second element to take into account, two Egyptologists, John Baines and Eke Engjeden, have both independently come to the conclusion that this toponym, because of how it's formed, cannot date from the Hellenistic period. The way it's formed is without an article at the beginning. and later toponyms in Egyptian, they typically start with pa or ta, and this one doesn't. So this is a strong sign in their view, and I think I would agree with that. I've done some other work on toponymy that this is an earlier motivation, so that this toponym would date from, at least according to them, the New Kingdom. So we're the time of the Ramesses. So we're in the mid-2nd millennium BC, so over a millennium before Alexandria. Third element related to toponymy worth taking into account what the toponym actually means. What's its original meaning? Doesn't mean everyone still thought of it as meaning it in the later periods, but originally when a toponym appears, it means something, regardless of its motivation. So since the 19th century, scholars have linked the root to the verb to build. In 1999, a French demoticist, Michel Chauveau, published a very influential article in which he proposes that the toponym was actually created while Alexandria was being built by Egyptian laborers. And so the Egyptians saw it as a giant building ground, and so they called it the building ground. And since then, this is a narrative. This is the interpretation that's been carried forward by subsequent scholars, especially but not exclusively in the French scholarly movement. And Cheden has proposed a new etymology, also in a French publication in 2016. Through thorough analysis, he proposes instead that it means the end of the habitations, which would be instead of about the Egyptian looking at the city being built for the Greeks, them just saying, well, it's by the sea, so it's the end of the habitation. So a more topographically anchored place name, which actually fits a chunk of Egyptian toponyms, as we can interpret them in the Egyptian language. And Cheden also builds on John Bain's study as well. And now I can expand on that in the Q&A, but it's very interesting to see some of the ways in which his article has been either not cited or discredited by subsequent scholars who go back to Chauveau systematically and do not quote him nor John Baines. A third group of evidence, geoarchaeological evidence. So I've already mentioned Jonde's publication of these underwater portuary infrastructures that date from well before the Macedonian conquest. They are earlier discoveries, actually, made in the area of the Serapeum, so in Makotis. In 1898, Giuseppe Botti, who was the first director of the Greco-Roman Museum in Alexandria and who has excavated quite extensively in the city, publishes an article in which he gives a quite detailed and fascinating description of tombs which he found in the rock south of the Serapeum. And he describes how these tombs also contain altars and small obelisks that are clearly, because of the way they're, because of the architecture, that are clearly pre-Hellenistic. These cannot be what scholars now call Egyptiaca, which are, the obelisk and pharaonic statues that you find in the northern delta, which were actually brought by later kings to adorn Alexandria, for instance. This is not the type of material that you cannot build an underground tomb like it's in the case. So it cannot fall in this category. Some of the small obelisks are catalogued together with some kind of portable structures in an earlier catalog of the museum. And interestingly enough, I have not found any mention of this discoveries anywhere else, except in one article from 2000 by an Egyptian scholar. So it's been published in 1898. It's been, it's been a while. It's been 120 years. I really searched hard. So if you find something, just send me an email because I really searched hard and I just could not believe it. I even met last spring with the last director of the museum. She had no clue about this. She didn't know about it. So I'm just offering this information. Now, more recently, advances in terms of collaboration between archaeologists and geomorphologists have led to even more interesting or striking data to be unearthed. So geomorphologists do corings in the soil, right? So they can go to foundation level very deep, and it's a narrow tube of earth, if you want, and they have the stratigraphy, and then they analyze what's in the soil, and then they can reconstruct past environment and how they fluctuated. Okay. So I put here 3 such studies which are relevant for us, and they show basically layers of occupation of the area of Alexandria that date from before the foundation of the city. In the case of the 2006 study, which was done in the area of the Lake Merriot, the French team found layers with remains of lead and copper that were not local. So you can study like the composition of these minerals and know where it originally came from, and it could come from either Turkey, the Eastern Mediterranean, or even possibly the Persian Gulf. And these were found in layers that date to the Old Kingdom or the pre-dynastic period. So we are in the 5th millennium BC. So already in the 5th millennium BC, there was some sort of direct or indirect international trade between the area of Alexandria through the lake and beyond. 2 quotes from these studies. So one, the 2006 one by Véron and other French scholars reads, "Our data are not consistent with the foundation of Alexandria ex nihilo. Pre-Hellenistic lead imprints suggest the existence of an in situ Bronze Age settlement as early as the 4th dynasty, so 25th century BC. So that's kind of the latest one. And then the following year, Jordan and his team published another study where you have evidence that can go as early as the pre-dynastic period. I mean, pre-dynastic to Old Kingdom, it's a big window for historians. It's like over 1,000 years. But the bottom line is we are at least 2 millennia and a bit more before Alexander came. Okay, so the visionary, like I don't know if you see where I'm going, the visionary nature of Alexander finding this spot, like it's the first one, is kind of does not really stand. And so the study includes this passage: Alexandria did not grow from a barren desert, but was built atop an active town that had for centuries exploited the safe harbors sitting along this Egyptian coast. And Véron also underlines in the passage I put on the screen before how the sheltered bay was too good an area. Like it doesn't make sense that no one before Alexander ever saw that this was a good place to stop with your ship. Something else we have to keep in mind, so 2 last elements actually. The first one is we are now in the midst of a multiplication of data that confirm that the area was very well occupied by both native Egyptians and people coming in and out from the Greek world and the Syro-Palestinian corridor. Right now we are in levels to the Ramesside period, so 1200. So I'm referring here to a series of archaeological survey or excavation in other sites around Alexandria. So there's the site of Platin here, which is about 40 kilometers west of Alexandria. Until maybe 5 years ago, they thought it was an Hellenistic site. Now they're down to a New Kingdom, so 1200 BC. And they have imports, ceramic imports from the Aegean. They also have inscriptions with cartouche of pharaohs like Seti I, Ramses II. Bahig is a site by the lake which also has Ramesside or early 1st millennium BC ceramic. To the east, 2 sites that are actually attested in literary evidence. So earlier scholars should have known about these sites. Canopus and Tonis Heraklion. Tonis Heraklion has been the subject of quite spectacular underwater excavations by a team led by Frank Gaudio And so they've been able to reconstruct the sequence of occupation of the site and also how it ended up sinking into the sea. But for what interests us today, we should take into account the fact that it was already an international, very thriving harbor with both Egyptian and non-Egyptian presence in the early first millennium BC. And the same goes for the city of Canopus, which was for a while at the mouth, the Canopus mouth of the Nile. And a last site, Nelson Island, which has been excavated, and I think they're still working there by an Italian team. The island was originally linked to the country, so it's the opposite of Pharos. And archaeologists have found a Pharaonic period cemetery, as well as a very early Hellenistic Greek settlement from right after the foundation of Alexandria by Alexander. Last element, we should also take into account, and historians who study the early history of Alexandria don't tend to do this very much, if at all, the fact that there's a pattern in Alexander's foundations during his conquest. So the foundations that happen to actually be real and not just a legend are systematically founded not in the middle of nowhere. Why would you found a city in the middle of nowhere? They are founded it's either like Byzantium, Constantinople, right? So it was already a regional satrapy capital. You found it on top of it as a new imperial foundation. You give it a new name, you rebrand it. Or they were founded close to an already existing local settlement. Okay? So I would like to argue that this is how we should look at the foundation of Alexandria. So I'm not trying to say that the city was not founded. I'm not trying to say that there was no change after the foundation. And of course there was. But it is part of a much more complex continuum that also completely involves Egyptian presence and all sorts of Egyptian presences. Not just urban, monumental, and imperial ones. And that leads me to the last segment of my talk. So I'll come back to my question. So how does all of this fit with common narratives about the foundation of Alexandria? I'm pretty sure you all already have a little idea of what I'm talking about. If you have questions, I'm going to take them after the talk. What I want to do now is give you 4 examples of narratives. So as I told you, I started, this is part of the book project, so I've started looking at narratives at the time of in the 17th century. We're going to move forward and give us 4 more recent examples from kind of standard books on Alexandria. So this one is one of the French books that's kind of the to-go book on the history of Alexandria. It's by a French epigrapher called André Bernard. It was called Alexandria the Great. You get the It was published in 1966, re-edited as is in 1996. And, sorry, this is a passage from the book. One only has to look at a map of the Egyptian delta to understand that the Alexandrian shore is not conducive to the establishment of a big city. These geographical imperatives must have been very powerful. For why did we have to wait for Alexander to see them finally questioned? Inhospitable coast, unsafe country, remote river, mostly sterile land. These are considerations that made the first Greek settlers step back, as enterprising as they were. P.M. Fraser wrote, I would think that's still the standard work in English about Alexandria. I mean, it's a masterpiece. It's huge. It's called Ptolemaic Alexandria. So Fraser's case is more complex, actually. He really discusses, he acknowledges Jean's work. He doesn't acknowledge Baptiste's discovery. But as you can see, his positioning is interesting. It's like, I'm acknowledging. It's like, do you sit dancing on 2 feet or something? Yeah, it's sort of like. So, okay, so he discusses the findings of Jean and says that Pharos was evidently part of a large and highly complex harbor.
But these findings are part of a historical context that remains extremely obscure, and they are best left out of account. Later on, he writes, there are indeed signs that the site of Alexandria was not virgin. What does virgin mean? We can reflect about that in the Q&A. So there are signs that it was not virgin. We should probably accept the picture of a fairly considerable conglomeration of native settlements, and here he refers to the pseudo-Callisthenes narrative, the chief of which was Rakotis. Even though the area, if then as bare as now, is not likely to have supported a very prosperous rural community. Archaeology neither confirms nor refutes this tradition as a whole. Remains of the period before the foundation of the Greek city are scanty, if they exist at all. In 1998, Jean-Yves Empereur was the founder of the Centre d'études Alexandrine, so one of the main centers of study in and about Alexandria. I published a book called Alexandria Rediscovered. And he writes, there was nothing on the coast apart from this obscure fishing village, Rakotis, about which we have no information. The Greek authors who wrote about the city and its history must have been misled by their ignorance of the Egyptian language into thinking that Rakotis was a pre-existing native settlement, and modern historians have followed them. The instinct of a Greek confronted with a newly conquered country was to open it up, to find a way of getting it out of its shell, to establish communications between this new dominion and the outside world, primarily, of course, the Mediterranean, the frog pond, as Plato called it. It was typically Greek behavior to look for a site facing north in order to promote seagoing traffic with the rest of the Greek world. But which was the right place to choose? Not the site of the delta, which flooded when the Nile rose. Alexander the Great preferred good, solid, rocky ground that did not give way under one's feet or disappear beneath the waters during the Nile flood. One last example. I could go on and on. One last example from a 2013 book on the Ptolemies' the Sea and the Nile. Throughout its recorded history, the fate of Egypt has been inseparable from the Nile. Seas lay both to the north and the east of the country, but the river Nile remained the defining and unifying feature of Egypt. Earlier Egyptian contacts in the Mediterranean had been of a more limited nature, with the exchange of goods and men rather than strategic concerns as the driving force. Blah, blah, blah. With the foundation of Alexandria, all this changed. Egypt now also looked north. So, what are we in the presence of here? There is seemingly a disconnect between the evidence I've shown you, even for earlier writings which did not benefit from all the findings, and the narrative, the core element of which remains strikingly stable through history. I would like to suggest that we are in presence of kind of a cycle of historical occlusion. So I'm not trying here to point fingers at individual scholars or to, throw blame at people, but to try to understand what is this story about and how are we repeating stories that are incomplete and what are we giving out. So there are some trends in the way the evidence are or are not discussed by historians. There is a focus on the foundation of Alexandria, and it is a future-orientated focus, right? We know what it's become, and what matters is that this man founded this, and it became this, right? So the focus is on the monumental, it's on the urban, it's on the commercial, it's on the imperial. The city's connection to the sea is constantly emphasized, much less so its connection to the lake and by extension to the Nile. And this comes also into play when we think of the trope of Alexandria at Egyptum, Alexandria by Egypt and not in Egypt. There is a tendency also to separate Pharos and Minos attested, which is attested in the Odyssey. But it's not really Alexandria. Pharos is Greek, it's in the sea, it's a harbor. Rakotis is Alexandria. Rakotis is a bunch of fishermen and herdsmen. It's not an agriculturally based sedentary economy. And likewise, by extension, the whole maritime area, so Alexandria and its hinterland, are really conceptualized as Greek and European, and so disconnected from the Nile Valley and Delta, which are properly indigenous Egyptian. So there is this idea that there was not really, it was not a real Egyptian presence. There is much less interest of scholars for the indigenous and non-urban modes of occupation of the land before the foundation of the city. The way it's covered is either anecdotal, it's completely ignored, or the subtext is that this is not, like what matters is that the city, the proper city, was founded at some point. That they were fishermen there or herdsmen is not of much interest. And there is little contextualization with the broader Macedonian or local regional context. So this is growing because now the data are really accumulating and scholars cannot ignore that. Well, archaeologists do not ignore it anymore, but historians tend in general publication to still ignore that. Speaking of historians, so what we see through the whole spectrum of historiography is a real fetishization of literary evidence, especially Greek and Latin, especially those who are aligned with imperial powers, especially Strabo. Those are obviously much later sources, and there is in general very little critical assessment of their biases and positionings. Anything, be it primary evidence or publications, think of Oke and Schkeden, article about a new etymological interpretation for Rakotis. So anything that doesn't fit the master narrative is either ignored, including through non-citation, or citation that discredit, or it is discredited. It's too romantic, it's too over the top. Well, we don't really have context, so we will push it aside and think of this quote from Fraser. Or it is downplayed, right? So, well, there were people, but it was a defensive garrison, and they were fishermen, they were barbarians, they were herdsmen. So what we end up in the presence of is a very dichotomic structure that, to me, proposes a somehow racialized landscape, where you have on the one hand an indigenous population and landscape that is passive, defensive in its relationship to the sea, to the other, and that is enclosed onto the Nile, static, and thus unable to maximize the full potential of this landscape. And on the other hand, we have Alexander and with him all the Greeks and Hellenized settlers who are civilized, very proactive, open to the sea, enterprising. They're bringing in progress. They're orientated towards the future, and they really make the area shine. Okay, they really bring to full fruition the potentialities of the landscape. If we put these historiographical narrative in the particular geopolitical context in which they were written by historians, right? So from the 17th to the 20th century, we see a clear parallel between, on the one hand, the ancient Egyptians and the modern Egyptian, mostly, though not exclusively, Muslim. And on the other hand, the Greeks, the Macedonians, the non-Egyptian settlers, and the modern European settlers in Egypt. So I remind you that, especially starting from Muhammad Ali in the early 19th century, there was quite a boom of European immigration to Alexandria. And so that went on all the way until Nasser and the aftermath of the nationalization of the Suez Canal in 1956. So the pattern that we see in terms of the story we tell ourselves about an ancient historical phenomenon is very much anchored into the particular geopolitical context in which the story is told. And this is something I would say crucial to any historical inquiry. We need to acknowledge that. And this has not been done very much in the case of Alexandria, and so we are left with this story of a visionary founder who just opened up Egypt and found something that was there that no one had seen before. This is very reminiscent of the colonial concept of terra nullius, right, which was used in many settler colonies, including on Turtle Island, to justify the appropriation of indigenous land. It doesn't belong to anyone. It was just there, up for grabs. And there is an interesting parallel here. And there's this idea that from the moment it's taken over by the Greeks or the Europeans, it becomes a civilized landscape. Civilized meaning sedentary, urban, agriculturally based, rather dedicated to foraging or fishing and other semi-nomadic activities. I will end with a quote from an excellent book, which I highly recommend. It's from Anne-Laure Scholar, who's a modern historian. It's called Duress, and she's the one who proposes this concept of occlusion, which I've completely adopted, and I'm not proselytizing this concept. So she writes, "To occlude is an act that hides and conceals, creates blockage, and closes off. Occlusion is neither an accidental byproduct of imperial formations, nor merely a missed opportunity, rendered visible to a critical witness after the fact. They are not just neglected, overlooked, or forgotten. Occluded histories are part of what such geopolitical formations produce." Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Dr. Blouin. And we have a little bit of time, so we can take some questions about this historical programming. This gentleman right at the back.
I'm curious about the last slide. You said that they're not simply forgotten. Does that mean like the sources aren't forgotten in the sense that this is a false narrative, or in the sense that if they are forgotten, it doesn't count as occlusion?
What do you think? I'm using the boomerang tactic, but I have something to say.
I'm not entirely sure off the reading of it which one it is.
I think it's complicated, right? So what she's trying to say is, it's complicated because that's why I was saying I'm not pointing fingers at individual historians. I'm saying there's kind of it's like a snowball effect, and some contexts are there all along. And either you do not look at them, but you know they're there, but you just choose somehow, consciously or not to put the light there, right? So from the moment you put the light here, you don't have light there. And if everyone keeps putting the light here, well, you know that the room is bigger, but you're not, you make a choice, right? So I guess if you go and see a therapist, you'll realize that there are things that you do or things that you didn't think you thought about. So it's kind of existential in that way. I don't know if it responds to your question. I don't know too convinced. Yes.
I see that this, to me, this focusing on Alexandria is sort of this example of, a very clear example of great man thinking, because and it's one of the people that Alexandria, these sorts of people tend to lionize more than any other. It's Alexander the Great's the notion that you have that history is moved and shaped by a few great individuals who, through sheer, and they often frame it as through sheer force of genius and personal brilliance and or whatever, are managed to change the world simply by this personal value, regardless of whatever the circumstances were that actually allowed them to do it. And I think that if you're talking about that people are particular, that the reason why people might fixate on Alexandria as being a specific case of this is because Alexander the Great is generally the person who they lionize, who's like the poster boy of this sort of breakdown thinking.
Yes, so thank you for emphasizing that. Maybe I didn't make it clear enough, but I completely agree with you. And there is a great book written by a French scholar, Pierre Blouin. I don't know if it's translated in English yet. It's called Alexandre Exégèse d'un mythe, so Alexander Exegesis of a myth. And he's basically studying this Alexandrinology, so the reception of Alexander from antiquity to today and globally. It's a fascinating book, and this is exactly the phenomenon you just explained. So my sense is that the story about Alexandria is just a branch of this, right?
Yeah.
So there is this obsession and this investment, this emotional investment into this story, because it is part of this broader mythology of Alexander. And then if you question the exceptionality of this particular event, then it can have ripple effect in terms of how you question the model as a whole, which is also part of founding discourses in terms of European and so-called Western identity. So thank you for pointing that out.
Got the front to the back.
I have a question. There's enormous underwater breakwater that presumably sunk down there from having once been above water. Can one extrapolate, someone like yourself, the power, the prosperity, the long-term planning just from the architecture, the building materials, the depth and so forth of that breakwater? So we know what was there before Alexander came.
Yeah. It's very interesting because, I mean, I'm not an underwater archaeologist. Jean Day was not an archaeologist himself, he was an engineer. So he provides, the book is quite lengthy, like over 100 pages. There are a lot of plates and descriptions of the material and how it's assembled. It's not been discussed very much by later archaeologists. There was a little wave after Tuil complained that no one was talking about it. Some scholars thought, my God, this is massive. So obviously it was built by the Greeks. So obviously it was the Minoans. So there's a theory that it's obviously the Minoans who did that. And then there was another theory which put the structures in parallel with those at Tyre in Lebanon. And so assigned these buildings to the Phoenicians. So the kind of the reflex is to say, this cannot be the Egyptians who would do that. And there are no literary narrative of any sort, even in Egyptian annals and inscriptions about this occupation. But likewise, these structures at Atlantis are not attested in literature either. So I would say there's been these conversations, and since then, well, we have the excavations underwater at Tunis-Heraklion, which have shown really like large-scale infrastructures, harbor infrastructures, and these were built by, the sponsor from the Egyptian pharaonic state at the time. So I wouldn't see why this couldn't have been the case with Alexandria, but it would be interesting to have other people go back and study this further. And in itself, I wanted to reflect on the silences as well. So I wanted to look, I mean, when you put all these things together, you think, how come you have all these silences? And I'm not saying everyone is doing that willfully, but there is a systemic system of reproduction of citation and historiographical focus that's interesting. So I hope I will have more to say. I'm now wishing that someone will take over this project, especially since I checked a few days ago even on Google Earth, and the land reclamation is very close to the area, and now the picture is very dark. So I'm also thinking that maybe, I don't know if the area is militarized actually. So part of the Egyptian shore is militarized, so you cannot access it. So that might be part of the problem.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. McKinnon?
Given that dynastic and late period Egypt is really a collection of small villages, there aren't any big cities really at that time compared to what it is in the world of antiquity. Odds are that any place that gets settled in Hellenistic times is going to be on or near, or at least have proximity to, or engage with a local village. So certainly some of these ideas that, oh, you get this whole new brand new city brought up, are kind of false when one looks at, one would be stupid to say it, because certainly the collection of villages would be so scattered that they'd be encountering, right? So that would be.
Yeah, I would also
something.
add that they were actually quite important urban settlements.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're referring to the early, like, two dynasties.
No, well, into the later period.
Oh, yeah, no, they were full on in the cities.
But my question would be, okay, in that case that Hellenistic cultures come in,
Yeah.
how much then of that kind of local syncretism or blending is there? Not so much on large scale things, yes, religion gets taken over and used in different forms, but more so on kind of the everyday nature that, for example, a local pot style gets decorated with a Hellenized pattern. In that case, it's sort of what everyone might be using, so it stays more on that popular level.
Yeah.
And we get a blending rather than a sort of total annexation of one or the other. So that might then lead to kind of this continuation of history where things don't get totally stopped and supplanted by a new one, as some of the historians want to say. But yes, there's real proof here of real cultural kind of transition or blending of people getting along, or these two cultures interacting for that kind of village scale to the city scale. Question
Yeah.
probably complicated all the stuff, but
Yeah,
what
but I mean-
nature is there in terms of that on the field things? Yes, we get a few archaeology that shows this and that, there's two different groups, but kind of more to bolster a hard, fast cultural interaction with two groups for that settlement and their interaction.
I mean, if we go, let's say, more up, and we look at Egypt, the model has been changing drastically over the past, let's say, 20 years. We now know that there were sustained contacts and Greek and presences of people from the Greek world and the Levant from way before what we thought before.
Yeah.
So we have Greek and Levantine imports in other cities all around the Delta, even more south.
Yeah.
That date from the early first millennium BC. I mean, floorings, Minoan floorings were found.
So why are there people still perpetuating this idea of they come in and there's nothing, or they
Well, but that's the whole question, like, there's an
But nonetheless,
I think some of them are stuck with great and man.
I think there are different phenomena. So archaeologists are just, a lot of them are just like, yes. But it doesn't translate to historians and to classicists very much. Like there's a clear delay. What's interesting also, even in the case of Alexandria, so there are some more recent discoveries around, I think in 2007, they did some emergency excavation downtown Alexandria, and they found a temple to Bubastis, so the cat goddess. And it's been partly published. And their earlier layers are from that's the thing, the report says that the earlier layers and ceramics that were found are dated from the last third of the 4th century. And they're not expanding. So I'm not a ceramicist myself, but the last third is basically 330 to 300. So why do you start at 330? You have a compelling ceramic evidence that proves that it cannot be from earlier. I mean, in some cases, there's one case where they say, okay, we have coins of Philip and Alexander. So that's kind of compelling. But is that compelling enough? Or are you also influenced in your dating by what you think about the area? And so these very early deposits also show that people, it was Greek users for all sorts of reasons, but the statues of the goddess are Greek in style, but it's an Egyptian goddess. So then there's this whole, Jean-Yves Encore published an article like a few months ago on that. There's this whole question, but how can how can Greeks have adopted the cult of an Egyptian goddess so quickly? Well, if you're a polytheist, if you're not in the monotheistic legend, it makes perfect sense it just makes perfect sense practically to do so. But then the whole narrative that it develops is, well, because there were Greeks around in all these settlements, so it acknowledges that, and the idea is, oh, most probably they were brought in by force. And it refers to a literary source about this man from the Pratis who was asked to basically move by force, a Greek who had settled in another city into the city. And so that's why they were already attuned to the goddess, right? So the overall picture shows a Greek presence much earlier and much more exchange than the traditional narrative. Somehow it's not made it to the mainstream kind of classic historical narrative. And then the other phenomenon you see is we are acknowledging more and more these other sites, but there is really this resistance to even properly acknowledging the occupation of the site before. And whenever it's acknowledged, it's, either there was nothing or it was residual, it was fishermen. But a community of fishermen, they are occupying the territory. Like, this is an occupation of a territory. And this is valuable in itself. Why do we think it's not valuable? Right? So you have different phenomena at play here. I know I think I'm all done to answer the question.
Maybe we have time for one more short question and long answer somewhere.
I'll try to be fast.
Take your time.
So I would say that your work falls into a category of work that I've seen more of lately, which is questioning the standard tellings of classical narratives, and there's been a real push in particularly on Twitter and in classics and academia to sort of decolonize, to say like, hey, we've got a racist history. We come in with, colonialism, we were developed alongside of it. We still have a lot of colonial thinking involved in this, and there's been a number of projects that have been developed to counter that sort of thinking, which I suspect is what's influencing the Alexandria and ignoring what was there before. So I guess my question is, for people who are working in classics, and particularly for people who are new to studying classics, as I'm sure many people in this room are, when you're looking at this, how do you combat it? How do you think beyond what are the standard narratives that the standard writing in the field has been? If you're not, say, out there doing the archaeology yourself.
Yeah. Well, you don't take anything for granted. So I would say first you go back to the primary evidence. I mean, there's only so much you can do when you're in a, undergrad course and you have an assignment, but, yeah, I mean, you cannot do a dissertation on every topic you're taught, but my intuition as a historian, or the way I do it is, and that's what I did in the talk, I went back to the evidence. And I went back to all the evidence. So this idea, I'm a historian, I'm not looking at geomorphology, I'm not looking at archaeology. Why? And vice versa. So you need to look at, you're not discriminating the evidence. You take all there is and you contextualize the evidence. And so on the other way around, it means when you read articles, you need to go back to, if they say something, is there a footnote? What are they referring? What is this thing? Okay, so what is this article? So what is the author of this article actually saying? You need to double check. So you don't take anything like for granted straight away. It's kind of need to be a bit of a troublemaker.
Maybe a last question?
Yeah, that was not too long.
No, that's right.
Yes.
What are the hallmarks of Alexandria's made up in a good system, like the port and Athens? Is there any evidence that the same inclusions occurred in Athens? Ignoring evidence of previous port activities, the same way, but the same sort of idea that speaks. It influenced the Macedonians to like port system, the same system. Port was ignored. In Athens was also ignored, the previous evidence was also ignored.
don't know, but that makes me think of something else that I've noticed that I want to expand on my book. It's kind of the reception of that. So when Muhammad Ali, made it easier for Europeans to come to Egypt in the 19th century, the city really was redeveloped and there was a boom, and that's when it became more European looking. And we see this mythology of cosmopolitan Alexandria being celebrated by writings all the way till today as kind of a new phase, like it's like a revival of the ancient Greek city. And what we see happening at the very same time in Greece is the recreation of Athens. So if you read Johanna Hannick's book, it's The Classical Death, I think, she shows how this process happens. And there is this clear parallel between this idea of recreating an ancient drama, an ancient Greek or European drama that had fallen into kind of oblivion following a Muslim conquest, so the Ottoman, right? Both cities were in the Ottoman Empire. And this process happens at the same time. This is not answering your question, actually. What made me think about that? I don't know.
The connections.
Yeah.
It's such an important matter that Alexander's way of the grid. And it followed from Athens laying out the grid system. And whether the same thing happened, exploring other activities in the book.
Yeah. That's a very good question, but I don't know. I'm sorry.
Given the process.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a good place to end with further questions, right? Further evidence to probe, further evidence to question, further footnotes to chase down. Before we thank Dr. Blouin, I just wanted to remind you all that our next talk is October 25th at 3 p.m. at the Merchants Corner campus when Dr. Matthew Sears from the University of New Brunswick is joining us to talk about